I would like to introduce to you the two debaters you will be listening to this afternoon. On the affirmative, you will be hearing code 276. 276. On the negative, you will be hearing 181. Code 181. Good luck, debaters.
Before I begin, I would just like to thank Scott One and the National Forensics League, Lincoln Financial, and Schwann's Foods for providing all of us with the opportunity to debate this week, as well as the Salt Lake City School District and the Church of Latter-day Saints for allowing us use of their facilities. I would also like to personally thank those who have helped me immensely over the past 4 years, Mazen Spady and Victor G. My coaches, Mike Bietz and Wiegand and Jess Bailey, Edina High School, Lynn and Joe Schmidt, and finally my teammates, Nick Green and John McNeil. I submit that if an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him or her is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, that individual is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. It's because I agree with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. I affirm the resolution that civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. I have one definition. According to Professor Michael Walzer in his book Obligations, civil disobedience is a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, in which a person breaks the law but does so in ways which do not challenge the legitimacy of the legal or political system. This person feels morally bound to disobey, but also recognizes the moral value of the state. Civil disobedience is a way of maneuvering between these conflicting moralities. Disobedience willingly accepts punishment, which is a key distinguishing factor between disobedience and other forms of crime like vandalism, which are intended to remain anonymous. The highest value for this debate is morality, since the resolution questions whether civil disobedience can be justified on moral grounds. Democracies trust individuals to make moral decisions, so the criterion for morality is individual conscience. As political philosopher John Rawls writes in A Theory of Justice, even though people normally seek advice and counsel and accept the injunctions of those in authority when these seem reasonable to them, they are always accountable for their deed. We cannot divest ourselves of our responsibility and transfer the burden of blame to others. My first contention is that what is legal is not what is moral. Laws can and have been grossly immoral throughout history, best illustrated with the help of the 1927 Supreme Court decision, Buck versus Bell. The state of Virginia was attempting to forcibly sterilize Mrs. Carrie Bell, an institutionalized inmate in a state facility. Mrs. Bell sued to prevent the operation. On an 8-1 decision, the court struck down the legal challenge. The majority opinion read, quote, "The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Denying the legitimacy of civil disobedience would mean not only that Mrs. Bell would be unjustified in attempting to resist this most inhumane of procedures, but that a doctor ought simply perform his duty and would in fact be remiss if he objected on principle. John Rawls, previously cited, agrees that in a democracy, law is not the ultimate moral arbiter. If the sovereign is held to govern by divine right as God's chosen lieutenant, then his subjects have only the rights of suppliants. They can plead their cause, but they cannot disobey should their appeal be denied. To do this would be to rebel against the final legitimate moral and not simply legal authority. But once society is interpreted as a scheme of cooperation among equals, those injured by serious injustices need not submit. By resisting injustice within the limits of fidelity to law, civil disobedience serves to inhibit departures from justice and correct them when they do occur. My second contention is that civil disobedience functions as a reciprocal check against society. I argue there are 2 truths fundamental to a democratic conception of the individual moral agent. The first truth is that citizens can't use the law to shirk their own moral responsibility. Throughout history, the claim, "I was just following orders," has been used to justify a wide variety of atrocities. But citizens can't ignore their conscience simply because the law says otherwise. The second truth is that law cannot be used to force individuals to suffer under oppression. Democratic respect for the individual entails a corresponding individual claim to resist outside domination. Civil disobedience functions to amplify the ideas of minorities, allowing them to enter into the democratic sphere as legislation or court decisions or be discarded. Jonathan Wolfe writes in his book, An Introduction to Political Philosophy, "Treating conscientious disobedience as treason in order to preserve social unity is surely a mistake. The dissenting citizen has a place. He or she should not be silenced for the sake of peace. Perhaps the majority is wrong. But even if the majority is right, attention still should be paid to dissenters. By way of analogy, even though an individual can use their right to free speech to distribute racist propaganda, this doesn't mean that free speech itself is immoral." Disobedience by unions like the IWW led to the introduction of the 40-hour work week and other workers' benefits. Women's suffrage groups also used the tactic to gain the vote. Yet just as civil disobedience is a check upon society, society checks civil disobedience. When Alabama Governor George Wallace tried to block implementation of desegregation laws, the National Guard was called in to fix the problem. Notice that all of these examples used the democratic process to try and effect change. None of them rejected the majoritarian system of lawmaking in any way. Individuals accepted punishment to publicize their message, which was then considered democratically and either accepted or rejected. Notice also that even though the intent of civil disobedience may be to cause change, the fact that it fails in some instances doesn't make it unjustified. A politician who runs for office and loses is not wrong for doing so, perhaps just unfortunately uncharismatic. Finally, it should be noted that civil disobedience can be a tremendously attractive option should the courts be unresponsive or the egregiousness of the problem especially demanding. At other times, it can be just one among many avenues, like the civil rights period, when disobedience, legal challenges, and grassroots efforts worked in tandem. And to be sure, civil disobedience is often difficult, or the threat of punishment may discourage its use. But it's the affirmative argument that the decision to use civil disobedience should be the individual's alone. If the individual wishes to accept the punishment and the risks that go with it in order to assuage his or her conscience, he or she is entirely morally justified.
Okay, so you say that basically because people are accepting punishment, they're morally justified in doing whatever their conscience tells them to do.
Well, that's part of the reason. I mean, it's not doing whatever their conscience tells them to do. There's a pretty strict definition of what it means to be civilly disobedient, which is completely different from what it means to be revolutionary. Like, my argument is that civil disobedience as a non-revolutionary encounter with the state has built-in limitations upon it, and that just as democracies recognize the inherent right of individuals, that means that civil disobedience has to proceed without violating those other inherent rights, which means that there are constraints upon
Okay, wait. So what if someone's
rights.
conscience tells them that other people's rights aren't valuable or that they should start a revolution?
Well, I would argue that's not justified. I mean, that's not what civil
Okay, wait.
disobedience
So we
is.
do have moral obligations to other people that take precedence over doing what we think is moral.
My argument is that there's individual disagreements over what it means to be moral. Now, since a democracy values the individual as the fundamental agent of moral choice, the individual should be able to accept punishment or act insofar as they don't harm other individuals. That's just because of the uncertainty that goes with knowing what is and what isn't moral, and also because of the fundamental value that democracies place on the individual.
Okay, so there are limits on how people can express what they believe, right?
I'm sorry, what?
Okay, you basically say that we can express our conscience insofar as we don't harm other people. Therefore, there are limits on how we can express our moral beliefs, correct?
Yeah, sure. It's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state, so you don't use violence because you don't challenge the legitimacy of the state. That means a couple things. One, it means that you accept the ability of the state to punish you. But two, it means that since the state is the organ in society with a monopoly on legitimate violence,
if
then
civil
you can't use
disobedience
violence.
is morally justified, then why is the state morally justified in punishing the civil disobedient?
Because the disobedient recognizes that there is value in law, or that there is moral value in the state.
But if
my argument is that
the civil
disobedience,
disobedient thinks that what they do is morally justified, then why would they let the state punish them? If they think the state is arresting them unjustly, why would they
Right, no,
accept
okay.
arrest?
The argument is that the state is enforcing an unjust law from the individual perspective. That doesn't mean, though, that the state is unjust or immoral in actually enforcing the law.
So we're
it just
looking
means
at
that
this
the
from an
individual
individual perspective?
is choosing to accept punishment as a way to cast light on the immoral law that they see in the
Why
government.
can't we cast light within legal channels?
You can.
Okay, then why is civil disobedience morally justified if we have another option?
Well, you can do lots of things, many different ways in a democracy. I can run for office or start an initiative or go talk to my representative. The fact that there are 3 different ways to get legislation introduced into a locality doesn't mean any of them are unjustified. I mean, the fact that I can walk or drive to the store doesn't mean that I'm a terrible person if I choose to drive.
Okay, let's go back to the idea of conscience. What if my conscience does tell me to harm other people? Should I listen to my conscience?
No, you can't. The argument I give you is that though individual consciences differ, the recognition of the inherent value in the individual in a democratic system puts checks on what an individual can and cannot do. I mean, it's all there in the definition if you want to look at it.
Okay. Before I start, I'd just like to thank the Lincoln Financial Group and the National Forensic League for making it possible for us to debate this week. I'd also like to thank my teammates, my coaches, all the Andes, and my parents and my sister. And I'd also like to thank my God, because I'm sure he had a lot to do with this. With that, now let's turn to the negative. While the affirmative may make civil disobedience sound like a wonderful way to promote change, he never explains why change means one person should have more power than everyone else. Because civil disobedience fails to respect other people's rights to have a say in democracy, I negate. The resolution asks whether civil disobedience is justified, so the value ought to be justice, defined as giving each his or her due. Specifically, justice in a democracy means giving each citizen his or her due in terms of political power and expression. Henry Mayo clarifies how democracy does this in an introduction to democratic theory. Democracy is unique in recognizing the political expression of conflicting interests and opinions as legitimate. Democracy provides for the peaceful adjustment of disputes, the maintenance of order, and the working out of public policies by means of its compromise function. The benefit of this compromise is that all interests and opinions are expressed and weighed fairly when no one can agree, rather than one person's interest dominating the rest. Therefore, the criterion for justice is fair consideration of interests. Ethicist Peter Singer writes, "The decision procedure in which all members have equal say in decisions and then accept the result is a paradigm of fair consideration. It is beneficial since a peaceful settlement of disputes is better than settlement by force, and it is just because it evaluates each interest fairly." My contention is that civil disobedience denies fair consideration of interests by asserting the power of one person over the rest of society and legitimizing the use of coercion to resolve disagreements. Civil disobedience, editor Dwight Murphy notes, is exquisitely embroidered with love and goodwill, but stripped to its essentials, it is the concept that every man can be his own judge and jury and legislator, that a minority has the right to flout the law, to force its will upon society. Breaking the law, unlike free speech or legal protests, unjustly limits the rights of others by undermining the role they had in making that law in the first place. There's no point to voting for the stance you want if someone can just override your vote at any time by refusing to obey the authority of the vote's result. Singer explains, in claiming that his own judgment entitles him to a greater say in the matter than the others, the dissenter is making a claim which the others could make, and which, if many of them did make, would be incompatible with a peaceful decision procedure. Due to the impossibility of reaching agreement, it would be best if everyone accepted compromise instead of acting on their own individual judgments. A society in which everyone acted on individual judgments would legitimize use of coercion to solve disagreements. Civil disobedience upsets legal avenues for social change, like public forums, where disagreements can coexist. Instead, it turns disagreement into conflict. When your spoken argument is made useless by the direct action of others, the only way to defend your beliefs is with retaliatory action. For example, if a racist restaurant owner decides to civilly disobey an equal rights protection law by kicking a black man out of his shop, the only way that man can get to eat inside the restaurant is if he forces his way in. Far from giving the minority a check against the majority, civil disobedience overrides checks that already exist in the law, turning disagreement into a battle of might is right, where the strongest group wins. Supreme Court Justice Charles Whitaker writes, minority groups, in preaching and practicing defiance of the law, are in fact advocating erosion and destruction of the only structure that can permanently maintain due process and the equal protection of the laws, and thereby protect them from discriminations and abuses. The key reason why democracy works is that people can express their beliefs in legal ways, such as public forums, voting, or legal protests, but refrain from acting on those beliefs in favor of peace and fairness. Civil disobedience destroys both, and that's why we negate. Now let's turn to the affirmative side. He gives you this value of morality and the valid criterion of individual conscience. Put them together because basically he defines morality as what the individual likes. However, while it's easy for my opponent to justify disobedience by looking at the problem through the eyes of one person at a time, it would be easy for it to be moral because then I would do whatever I think is right. However, the resolution is about individuals in the context of a democracy, which is a society containing multiple people. Therefore, the only way to universally justify the resolution as a general principle is by affirming for all people at the same time collectively. In other words, disobedience must be justified for everyone in a democracy. Now, if everyone has absolute moral authority and absolute individual conscience, as he claims, then rights will always conflict, and then none will matter. But law limits absolute rights so everyone can enjoy them at least partially. Because multiple people have equal rights, the only way to maximize them for an entire society as once is to have obligations that consider others as well as yourself. He basically admits this in cross-examination, where he tells you that even if your individual conscience tells you to harm other people, you can't do that because you have to consider your moral obligations to other people before you consider your moral obligations to do whatever you think is right. At that point, you can't look towards this absolute value of morality with the criterion of individual conscience because everyone has their own conception of morality. That's why you look towards the value of justice to make sure that everyone has their due in expressing their own moral beliefs and their own individual conscience. And you look towards the criterion of fair consideration of interest because that criterion prioritizes your moral obligations to other people over your moral obligations to follow your own conscience. Go to his contention 1 now. He talks about how laws can be immoral. However, the individual can be immoral as well. He still hasn't proven any sort of definite benefit to the affirmative side in terms of morality. The problem is he talks about all these inhumane procedures, but the problem is that the law could just as well be protecting rights. I gave you the example of the equal rights protection law and make sure that whites and blacks can eat together in a restaurant. But people can civilly disobey that on an individual level because racists might think that it's right to be racist. At that point, he can't even achieve morality because there's this problem of basically people can be wackos. Okay, turn to his contention 2 now. He talks about how democracy looks towards the individual moral agent, and we always have our own individual responsibility to change laws. However, remember, we can't change laws however we like. He admits in cross-examination that we have moral obligations to others that take precedence over how we would like to change laws. At that point, you can't change laws by doing whatever you like and enacting change by breaking laws. You have to work within the democratic procedure because it makes sure everyone has some sort of fair and equal say. Then he says we can't be forced to suffer under oppression, but remember, I told you that laws can prevent oppression, like that equal rights protection law. Okay, then he talks about how just because we have the right to free speech and people can use it for racist propaganda doesn't mean that the right to free speech is bad. At that point, he's looking towards the moral justification of the act of civil disobedience itself. But that means that if we're only looking at the act, then he can't derive any benefits from expressing individual conscience, because we're no longer looking at the motives of individual conscience behind the act, we're only looking at the act itself. Finally, he talks about how if we accept punishment, it's all okay. However, a study from the University of North Carolina shows that even homicide committers accept punishment, but obviously they're still not morally justified in what they do.
Okay, sorry, what was the last thing you said? I just didn't hear it.
I basically said that even if people accept punishment, that doesn't mean the act they committed or they accept punishment for is necessarily morally justified.
Okay. Okay, so the criterion then is fair consideration of interests,
Sure.
right? And you say that we can't settle problems by force.
Right.
Okay, so if civil disobedience isn't forceful, and if I say anyone can be civilly disobedient, have I met your standard?
Basically, I'm saying the way you morally justify civil disobedience sets up a decision procedure in which things do turn forceful.
Okay, so I just want to know exactly, just like so we can make this clear and so there's no ambiguity after this,
Okay.
the steps I need to go through to meet your standard of what it means to have fair consideration of interests. Mm-hmm. The first is that you can't be violent, right?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to just write these down. The first
The
is
idea of fair consideration of interest is basically that the moral obligations you have towards others take precedence over doing whatever you like in your own individual conscience.
so the first is that it's nonviolent. The second is that it's universal, right? We say everyone should be able to do it.
Sure, you have to justify some sort of decision procedure for everyone.
Okay. And so if I show you that an action is nonviolent, that it still respects other people, and that anyone can do it, I should win.
No.
Okay. No, okay, so what are the other, what other things should I do?
Okay, basically, I argue that civil disobedience is an act of, expressing your own belief over other people, right? Even if you say it respects others, the action itself doesn't respect others because it denies everyone's authority in the vote.
Okay, so we just have to respect other people's authority. That's the fourth argument.
I'm sorry, I can't hear because of the microphones are kind of echoing.
So all we have to do is respect other people's authority, and that's the fourth plank of what I need to do in order to win.
I'm hearing fourth plank, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Your argument is that we respect other people by respecting their authority.
Sure. You're talking about individual conscience, right? I'm saying everyone has an equal right to have individual conscience.
Right. So as long as we respect the authority of the majority, then we're respecting other people and we're meeting your criterion of fair consideration of interests.
Sure.
Okay. So respect the opinion. Fabulous. Okay. Your argument is that the law can protect racists, right? And racists can do bad things.
Sure.
Okay. Now, I can vote for the Ku Klux Klan, even though certainly there's not a lot of fondness in that group for members of my religion. I could still vote for them if I chose to, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that, voting itself is terrible, and in all likelihood, the Klan is not going to win, or even if they do, there will be constitutional checks that prevent them from enacting their policies.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so the fact that I can vote for something that we all find fairly morally repugnant, cross your fingers, is not a reason that voting is bad?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
In his last speech, the negative tells you that we need to have fair consideration of the interests of individuals. And then in cross-examination, although it was a little bit hard to hear, we set up 4 planks that I need to meet in order to meet his standard. So the first is that it's non-violent. Remember, that's fine. I tell you, civil disobedience doesn't encompass violence because it's a non-revolutionary encounter with the state. And since the state is the organism in society that has a monopoly on legitimate violence, civil disobedience precludes any sort of violent action. That's the first plank. The second plank is that it's universal, that everyone should be able to do it. That's fine. I grant that some people might use civil disobedience in ways we don't like. The governor of Alabama might try and stop blacks from entering schools after desegregation orders have been filed. I'll grant that. My argument, though, is that society has reciprocal checks to prevent that, so the National Guard gets sent in and actually allows those students to go forth. So it's universal, second plank. The third argument is that I still respect authority. Remember, civil disobedience takes place still recognizing the legitimate authority of the state. A civil disobedient is punished. The reason we have laws to say if you break such and such a statute, you will be hit with such and such a penalty. The person who does that through civil disobedience accepts the ability of the law to punish, i.e., they accept the authority of the majority to pass whatever laws they want. Civil disobedience is just another avenue for the minority to amplify their voices and get them into society. So the fourth argument and the fourth plank that I meet is that we're still using democratic processes. Remember, civil disobedience still go through the courts. They still try and persuade the majority. At that point, you're still respecting everyone. So look to his criterion of fair consideration of interests. Fine, it's completely fair. The individual who commits civil disobedience isn't saying that they're any better than anyone else or that the law ought not apply to them. They're just saying that they choose to accept the consequences of breaking a law. Look to the first contention then, where he says that civil disobedience asserts the power of one member over society. Remember, that's completely untrue. Civil disobedience is just one part of an integral mechanism between society and the individual. It doesn't say the individual is better than society or outside society's laws. It says that the individual will, for a moral reason, choose to break a law and accept punishment. Then he gives you a Singer card saying that everyone should compromise because if everyone was disobedient, there would be chaos. Well, remember, if everyone filed a civil suit in court, then the courts would be clogged and shut down. And if everyone wanted to hold an assembly under their rights guaranteed in the First Amendment, then no one would be available to go to assemblies, and no one would go. So the fact that if everyone would do something, it would destroy the process, isn't a reason to reject civil disobedience any more than it is a reason to reject civil suits. The next argument he gives you is that racists might kick blacks out of a restaurant and they have to force their way back in. Remember, that's completely untrue. The federal government would probably go in and stop those people from stopping legitimate customers from entering an establishment. So look to the affirmative side of the flow. His argument is that we look to the conscience of democracy and you have to respect all people. You have obligations to consider others. Completely fine. I admit that in the definition of what civil disobedience means. Then he tells you the individual can be immoral. My argument is the state can be immoral too. So we should allow the individual moral conscience to act as a check upon society within the limits I prescribe in my definition. His next argument is, again, he repeats the racist argument. Remember, my argument is it's a reciprocal check law fixes. What Rawls then tells you is that in a democracy, the sovereign isn't the final moral authority. This is pretty important. It says that the law doesn't have inherent moral value, so there's no moral obligation to obey it. The second contention then says that civil disobedience is a check. He tells you laws can stop oppression. I say civil disobedience is another avenue. He says we have to work within the system. That's fine. I'm still accepting the system. Remember, civil disobedience uses the democratic process as a way to effect great change. And then he tells you that we're not looking at motives. That's fine. I'm saying it's always a good thing to be faithful to your own moral conscience within limits. So as long as an individual has fidelity to their own moral compass, that's a moral thing regardless of the motive.
Okay. Let's start with the value and the value criterion. Basically, he doesn't answer the argument where I told you that morality is subjective, which he agrees to in cross-examination. He says that all individuals have different moral beliefs. At that point, everyone has all this moral agency, but the resolution is asking us to morally justify civil disobedience in the context of a democracy where multiple people exist. At that point, if everyone has this equal right to express their moral individual conscience, as he's saying, we can't have this absolute right because it's going to conflict all the time. Therefore, we have to accept restrictions on how we can express our moral beliefs, or else we'd have clash all the time. Essentially, if we want to guarantee some sort of fairness and equality in moral expression of individual conscience for everybody, we have to find some sort of compromise. That's why we look towards the value of justice, giving each their due in terms of moral agency and expression of their moral beliefs, and the value criterion of fair consideration of interests, so we can make sure that everyone gets a fair and equal say in this. He gives 4 reasons why he does fulfill the fair consideration of interests. The first is that he says it's non-violent, so therefore you're not harming anyone. However, this contradicts his case position, because his case position says to do whatever your conscience tells you. I told you at the end of the last speech that some homicide committers think that their conscience tells them to harm others. At that point, he agrees that the moral obligations you have towards others take precedence over doing what you like. But then he says, we disagree on what these moral obligations are. At that point, the only way you can determine some sort of moral obligation rule for society is to make sure that everyone has a fair say in what moral obligations to other people are. That's what happens in democracy. Everyone votes on what's the ground basis for how you can treat other people. You can still express your beliefs through legal channels, but you can't express them however you like. You still have to follow some basic moral obligations in how you treat others. That's the point of democratic law. It gives you this ground basis, these moral obligations on how you have to treat other people. No one agrees on what those moral obligations are. Therefore, we vote and we come to some sort of compromise so that everyone has equal moral agency. But then, if he admits that moral obligations to others take precedence over doing what you like, at this point, he already says disobedience is unjustified, because it's asserting your moral agency over other people's rights and your moral obligations to other people. That's the first voting issue of the negative side, that in order to have this fair consideration of interest, moral obligations to others take precedence over your own right to do whatever you think is right. Okay. Now let's go to the second reason why he says he fulfills fair consideration of interest. He says, well, he just has to prove it's universal. And he says society has reciprocal checks. And basically he says, well, you accept punishment. That's his third voting issue, third reason why as well. But basically, I told you in the last speech that just because you accept punishment doesn't mean your act was morally justified. I gave you the example of homicide committers who think they're morally justified in killing other people. If he says, well, this is a violent example, I mean, I can give you other examples like thieves who think stuff really belongs to them, so they just go and steal it. And that's not really violent, but it's still harming other people. At this point, even if you accept punishment for your act, it's not going to be morally justified. So all his stuff about accepting punishment, which he really seems to rely on throughout his case, doesn't make civil disobedience morally justified. That's the second voting issue of the negative side. Okay. Then his fourth reason why he fulfills fair consideration of interest is because basically we're still having this legitimate democratic process. He says it's one part of the balance between society and the individual. But I already told you in my first voting issue as a negative that your moral obligations are defined by law, because that's where everyone gets an equal say to say what these moral obligations are. And these moral obligations take precedence over doing what you think is right. So it's not really part of the balance between society and the individual. It's the individual imposing their moral beliefs on everyone else. So then you look to my first contention, where I told you about basically is looking towards asserting your power of one individual over the rest of society. He says, well, it's just part of the balance, and the federal government is going to come in. But basically, what happens is, by saying you obey some sort of higher moral law than the one that everyone else has agreed on, you're saying that your moral beliefs matter more than everyone else. At this point, there's no fair consideration of interest, because you're not considering other people's moral beliefs, you're only considering your moral beliefs. So he's not achieving morality or justice on any level. That's going to be the third voting issue of the negative. But the fourth voting issue of the negative is going to come from the very bottom of the negative case, where I told you if the minority is justified in breaking the law, the majority is going to justify disobedience right back. That's going to cancel all the institutional checks that already exist in the law and turn conflict resolution into a battle of might is right. He says the federal government is going to come in, but that's a factual statement. We're looking at moral justifications here. And if he morally justifies it for the minority to disobey in order to defend themselves, then he also has to morally justify it for the majority to come right back and repress the minority even more. I give you an example, like say the black people decide to more civilly disobey a law. Basically, they want their equal rights. Then the white people are going to come right back and civilly disobey an equal rights protection law or a due process law to oppress the minority even more. At that point, there's no solving problems at all. Then go back to the affirmative case, where he talks about how the state can be immoral too and individual morality is a check. But the state is a synthesis of individual moralities. It allows everyone an equal chance to express their moral individual beliefs. That's why there's a fair consideration of interest on the negative side and none on the affirmative. Finally, he says the sovereign isn't the final moral authority, and we have to be faithful to our own conscience, but he already agreed that moral obligations to others take precedence over following your own conscience. And since the state is the expression of those moral considerations to other people, you have to follow them. For these reasons, you vote negative in today's round.
Okay, I realize that there were more than 2 voting issues given in the negative rebuttal, but I think that all of his arguments basically boil down to 2 arguments. The first is that we can't do whatever we want because we have some sort of obligation to other people. Granted, I tell you, civil disobedience means respecting that obligation and respecting the inherent individual worth of other people. That's why it's nonviolent. That's why it's a way of maneuvering between the conflicting moralities of the state and the individual. At that point, I'm saying there are limits on civil disobedience, but as long as you don't harm other people, it's still justified. Remember, the law exists to punish people who violate it, and people who violate laws through civil disobedience are punished. So at that point, you are not saying that you can do whatever you want to other people. You're just saying that if you choose to accept individual punishment and not hurt anyone else, it's entirely your decision. The next argument he gives you is that we shouldn't impose our beliefs on other people or say that they're more important. Remember what I tell you, that doesn't happen either. Civil disobedience is universally justified no matter what your belief is, just as I am universally justified in using my right to free speech to talk about whatever I want as long as it doesn't incite violence. So what that means then is that even if we disagree with other people, it's not saying that our rights are more, or our morals are more important than theirs. It's saying that we choose to use this avenue as a way to promote discussion. Remember that I'm telling you we use the democratic process when you're civilly disobedient. That as soon as you disobey a law, it enters into the courts or you try and generate public opinion to pass new legislation. So you're still respecting society's beliefs. My argument is that since morality differs from individual to individual, as long as the individual stays within the prescribed limits I give you and respects the individual agency of other actors by not using violence, by not destroying property, by accepting the punishment laid down by the majority, it's entirely good that they follow their own moral conscience. Remember, they might go to jail or they might be fined, but if they believe they're doing the moral thing, that's fine, and it's not our decision to make to tell them they ought not do it. Additionally, remember what John Rawls tells you, that in a democracy, the sovereign isn't the final moral authority as would exist in an authoritarian government or a monarchy. So that means there's no moral obligation to obey the law, which isn't moral in any instance. He tells you that the law can be immoral, but I'm saying that because there's no fundamental moral quality to the law, there doesn't exist a moral obligation. Then the only other argument he's really got going for him is that the majority then can oppress the minority. But my argument is that civil disobedience is only one of several different checks in society, and that if the majority tries to oppress the minority, like the governor of Alabama did, then the societal legal system will step in and stop him from doing that. So at that point, there is no violence, there's no infringement of other people's rights. All I'm allowing people to do is remain faithful to their own moral conscience. That's always morally justified, as long as you don't cause harm to other people. So that's the reason then that you affirm the resolution.